Welcome to This Explainer. We're diving into a historical drama that honestly plays out like a Hollywood thriller. We are talking about the rise, fall, and vindication of Galileo Galilei. This is the story of a man who essentially birthed modern science, not just through pure raw genius, but through sheer hustle, clever marketing, and just a relentless, absolute drive to figure out how the physical world actually works.
So the big question is, how exactly does a guy looking at stars become a persecuted heretic? Well, to figure that out, we actually need to drop right into the middle of the action. Picture this. It's the bitter, cold winter of 1610. A mathematician takes a telescope, one he actually refined himself, by the way, points it straight up at the night sky and aims it directly at the planet Jupiter. And what he saw out there in the dark, it completely, utterly shattered humanity's entire understanding of the universe.
70? That is the number of years the idea of the Earth revolving around the sun existed completely peacefully before the Catholic Church finally banned it. You see, a Polish scholar named Nicolaus Copernicus actually proposed this heliocentric model way back in 1543. And for over 7 decades, it was just sitting there. Just a quiet, relatively obscure mathematical theory. Nobody really cared. It wasn't until Galileo showed up and started producing hard, undeniable, look-through-my-telescope visual evidence that the church panicked and threw Copernicus's work on the prohibited list. So what made Galileo such a massive threat?
Let's kick things off with Section 1, the rebel stargazer.
To understand the man, we've got to rewind to 1564, to Pisa, Italy. Galileo is born into what you might call a scientific drought. The world was still clinging to ancient Greek texts that literally hadn't been seriously challenged for centuries. Now, he initially studied medicine at the University of Pisa, mostly because, well, it paid the bills. But his curiosity was just too rebellious. He ended up ditching that lucrative degree for the much riskier, far less profitable study of math and physics. And the main concept he championed was brilliantly simple. Gravity matters, not mass. During his lecturing days, he supposedly did this famous thought experiment, maybe even a literal one, the jury's still out, at the Leaning Tower of Pisa. He basically showed that if you drop different-sized cannonballs, they don't fall at different speeds just because one is heavier. And by proving that, he started chipping away at the untouchable, almost godlike status of ancient philosophers like Aristotle.
Moving right along to Section 2, Math, Money, and Marketing. So, jump to 1592. Galileo heads over to the University of Padua, and he spends a solid 18 years there, probably the happiest of his life. But underneath all that, the guy was drowning in financial stress. He was in a long-term relationship with a woman named Marina Gamba. Now, because of his social standing and strict university rules, they couldn't actually get married, but they did have 3 kids together. Bottom line, Galileo desperately needed cash. He needed a stable income to support his family. So when he built that high-powered telescope in 1609, he didn't just casually stargaze. He leveraged it. He cranked out a 60-page blockbuster of a book called The Starry Messenger, and in it, he drops these massive bombshells. The moon wasn't a perfect sphere. It actually had jagged mountains and valleys. There were literally millions of new stars out there you couldn't see with the naked eye. And the craziest part? He found 4 separate moons orbiting Jupiter. And here is where we see his absolute masterclass in 17th century marketing. Galileo didn't just publish this mind-bending stuff, he weaponized it for his career. See those 4 new moons? He named them the Medicean stars. Why? Because Cosimo II de' Medici, the incredibly wealthy Grand Duke of Tuscany, and his brothers were the perfect patrons. It was straight-up flattery, and you know what? It worked perfectly. Within months, Galileo gets appointed chief mathematician and philosopher at the Medici court in Florence. It was the ultimate cushy gig, great pay, and absolutely 0 teaching duties. Which brings us to Section 3, a collision with dogma. Of course, more fame means more eyeballs on you, and the tension really started cooking. Galileo's hard visual evidence was now aggressively slamming into accepted Christian dogma. The prevailing thought was, God created humans, therefore humans and the Earth must sit perfectly motionless right at the dead center of the universe, period. But in 1613, Galileo writes this infamous letter to Benedetto Castelli, and in it, he goes hard on separating faith from reason. He essentially argues that biblical scripture and scientific inquiry are 2 totally different lanes. His vibe was basically, the Bible tells you how to go to heaven, not how the heavens go. It was an incredibly bold defense of the Earth orbiting the sun, and it put him directly, squarely in the crosshairs of the Roman Inquisition. And that sets the stage for our climax, Section 4, the trial of Galileo. Okay, so back in 1616, the Inquisition had already given Galileo a very stern warning. Basically, stop talking about the Earth moving. And for years, he actually listened. He kept his head down, maintained this anxious silence, and stuck to much safer topics, like comets. But a guy like Galileo, he couldn't stay quiet forever. In 1632, he breaks that silence and drops the dialogue concerning the two chief world systems. Now, trying to dodge the Inquisition's wrath, he cleverly, and let's be honest, kind of passive-aggressively, frames the whole book as a Socratic debate. Take a look at the breakdown here. You've got Salviati, who argues the Copernican view. That's basically Galileo's stand-in. Then you have Sagredo, the neutral guy in the middle. And finally, Simplicio, who argues the traditionalist, earth-centered view held by the Church and the Pope. Sure, he framed it as an objective debate, but spoiler alert, Salviati absolutely demolishes Simplicio in every single argument.
Real quick, before we get to the massive fallout from that book, I want to highlight this brilliant little side discussion inside it. Galileo effortlessly explains what we now call Galilean invariance, or relativity, without using any dense math. Imagine you're on a ship, moving at a nice steady speed across the ocean. If you climb up and drop a rock from the very top of the mast, where does it land? Right at the base of the mast. Not behind it, the moving rock appears static relative to the frame of the moving ship. This brilliantly simple mental picture proved that the Earth could absolutely be hurtling through space without us feeling the wind in our hair, so to speak. He literally laid the foundation for modern physics right there. But, the Inquisition didn't really care about rocks falling on ships. They cared about their absolute authority. Now, Galileo thought he was safe publishing this in 1632 because his buddy, the cultured Pope Urban VIII, had just been elected a few years earlier. But Galileo made one absolutely fatal error. Remember that traditionalist character, Simplicio? Well, the name heavily implies simpleton or simple-minded, and by putting the Pope's actual arguments into the mouth of a character named Simplicio, he deeply, publicly insulted the Pope. Worse, he did it right in the middle of the incredibly bloody 30 Years' War. The Church was feeling vulnerable, and they were in absolutely no mood to tolerate internal rebellion. So, in 1633, Galileo is dragged down to Rome, put on trial, convicted on suspicion of heresy, and forced to publicly recant his entire life's work. So the fallout. Section 5. A smuggled final masterpiece.
What do you even do after being totally silenced by the most powerful institution on the planet? Well, Galileo was sentenced to house arrest in Tuscany for the rest of his life. And tragically, by 1638, he goes completely blind. But here is the thing. His eyes failed, but his drive absolutely did not, completely defying the Inquisition's strict ban on him publishing anything. Ever again, he sits down and writes his grand finale on physics in motion, discourses relating to two new sciences. Obviously, no one in Italy would touch it, so the manuscript was secretly smuggled north to the much more liberal Dutch Republic, specifically Leiden in 1638. And guess what? It was a massive hit. Dozens of copies were actually smuggled all the way back down into Rome, right under the Inquisition's nose, and they sold out instantly.
Which brings us to the final act of the story. Section 6 birthed the scientific revolution.
Galileo died while still under house arrest in 1642. He was 77 years old. But because he wrote his later books in everyday Italian instead of that dusty academic Latin, his ideas spread like wildfire. They were quickly translated, like Thomas Salisbury's English versions in the 1660s, and it caused this unstoppable, massive ripple effect across all of Europe. The Inquisition's censorship, a total failure. Today, Galileo is known as the father of modern science. And that is not just some casual nickname, that is the literal title given to him by some of the greatest minds in history, including Albert Einstein and Stephen Hawking. His hyper-meticulous work on motion and gravity paved the exact path for Isaac Newton, who, crazily enough, was born the exact same year Galileo died, to eventually publish his world-changing Principia. As we wrap up, I want to leave you with a question to chew on. Think about that moment Galileo knelt in front of the Inquisition and formally took back his life's work, denying his true beliefs about the universe. Was that a cowardly betrayal of scientific truth? Or was it just the practical, necessary survival tactic of an old man trying to stay alive? It is a heavy, profound question about where truth, power, and human endurance intersect. Thanks so much for diving into this explainer with me today. Keep asking those tough questions, always look at the evidence, and I will catch you in the next one.